All right. Thank you again for joining. If you're joining live, and obviously if you end up hearing this later, thanks for listening to it. Today's session, we were going to cover ransomware containment and eradication planning. We've gone ahead and added a quick section on the FBI hack that occurred last month, so we'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about that. And on that note, introducing myself again, if you've never been here before with me, Dr. Jerry Craig. My background was an active duty U.S. Marine and then a contractor with the DoD for the Marine Corps for over a decade, as well as 6 years supporting CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So the main sectors that I've supported throughout my career has been defense and healthcare. And I've worked in every role from an engineer on the networking and IT side up through PM and vice president, CISO, et cetera. So try to get a well-rounded background so that the security components make a lot more sense when you tie them to IT. Today's agenda, we are going to cover some quick live stream changes that are going to be occurring, and then we will go into our ransomware discussion, brief overview, some evolution of ransomware, and then into the more of the meat and potatoes, which is the containment and eradication. The strategies are, you'll see as we talk about things that we should be doing or what we can be doing, the understanding of the evolution of ransomware becomes important, because something that was applicable 20 years ago may not be today, and we may have to go a different route, et cetera. Some best practices to avoid ransomware. That's sometimes the best strategy is just not being susceptible to it. And then, as I said, we'll cover a few minutes in the November 2021 FBI email hack. So starting with the upcoming live stream changes, the calendar invites that we had out and the sessions posted on the Antiva site are listed for all of 2021. We will be getting ready to start populating 2022. And a couple of the changes that we're going to make are, we will likely put out quarterly topics. So that way, if we see something that comes up that's really critical and we need to make a shift, we haven't already put out something for July and you're expecting to see that, and then something comes up and it makes it difficult to shift that. So we'll try to do it like in 3-month blocks to make sure everything is relevant. The other thing is we're going to move to a monthly presentation versus the twice a month. Want to make sure that we're getting, not taking up too much of folks' time, make sure all the content's relevant, et cetera. Okay. So ransomware overview. I wanted to give a definition of this. There's quite a few out there. This one I pulled from Trend Micro, but just a level set in case you're not familiar with ransomware, where you hear it a lot on TV or in the news, but you're just still kind of like, well, what is it? What does it do? It's really a type of malware that prevents or limits users from accessing their system. And it's typically done by either locking the system screen or locking the user files until you pay a ransom. Most of the common ransomware attacks that we see today are going to lock up and encrypt the user's files, and then they're going to get some type of screen that tells them that, hey, you've been attacked, and here's, you want your files back or you want access to your data back, you've got this time limit and you need to go to this site, you need to pay this money. And right now, the current trend for the majority of these attacks will be Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, but obviously as time evolves and other cryptocurrencies become maybe as mainstream, you might see, you might see a lot of different variations in how attackers request things. But for now, that's kind of just the basic definition and general way that things take place. The evolution, I want to spend a couple minutes on this because most folks, even myself, I wasn't aware that ransomware had been around for as long as it had. I was under the impression that it started kind of in the late 90s, but upon further research, the earliest case actually occurred in 1989. And if any of us on this call are, old enough to know what floppy disks are and have used those before, at this particular event, the World Health Organization held an AIDS conference and 20,000 floppy disks were distributed to the attendees. The floppy disks were infected with ransomware. These attendees went back to their homes, their organizations, wherever they, loaded the data, and then they were given this ransomware message, and they were to pay $189. Back in 1989, I'm sure $189 was a little more than it is today, but still not too bad. A few $100 maybe in today's terms. It wasn't a lot happening in the 90s, kind of skipped over that, that's very minor. But then all of a sudden in the mid 2000s, ransomware started to pop up and become more prolific. And they started to change what they were doing, how they were doing it, and what they charged. And you can see here in the mid 2000s, I put a couple up here as examples. But they were really focused on quantity over quality. They didn't really care too much about how good was the software, could you bypass it. It was just, can I blast this out to as many people as possible? And I'm only going to charge $20. So the logic behind it is most people would just pay the $20 because they don't want to lose, their data or lose access to it. They made a decent living off that, I guess, and things progressed until we hit the early 2010s. Then you start to see the behavior change as well as the cost. New variants started to lock users out of their computers completely. They started demanding Bitcoin as currency. And again, that, this is ramped up over time. So there may be folks that say, I don't remember hearing about it that far back. And that may be the case. But Bitcoin did exist and they did start asking for it. And then they introduced these ransomware rental services on the dark web. So other folks would create the packages and programs and executables and malware to send to people, and you could go out there and rent that as a service from them so that they, as the developers, weren't actually the ones infecting anyone. They were just making it available like a COTS product, and then someone else went out, bought it, and infected folks. So in some respects, this was really good for them. They could decrease the risk, they could get paid, they don't have to do any of the work other than develop it, and then someone else goes and runs it. The obvious problem to the world and all communities here is that once you can rent it as a service, now you take people who had no ability to develop and distribute this ransomware, and now they can because they've paid someone else to do the difficult part. One of the ransom totals alone came to $27 million, and that was tied to CryptoLocker. So CryptoLocker was one of the most profitable and well-known ransomware packages out there. And you can see jumping from asking $189 or asking $20 to organizations potentially, and I say organizations lightly, groups of individuals that are doing this, making $27 million is very lucrative, highly profitable. So the demand and interest is obviously going to increase. That increase we continue to see in the mid 2010s, except in this case, they started to shift to how they access things and specifically what they access. So now the new variants are targeting Android devices, SD cards, they've introduced new file types, they've hit systems like Linux hosts and Mac hosts, who most people, I think, equate those two operating systems and maybe a couple others to being less susceptible to vulnerabilities and attacks, but they started to include them. And then in 2016 and on, kind of stopped and broke it out year by year because there were some major or critical changes that occurred. One was that in 2016, entire hard drives became encrypted, and this was done with a single action versus doing individual files. So rather than having a laptop, for example, with 10,000 files and one by one it's encrypting it, it just encrypts the entire thing, makes it much faster and much easier and less likely that you would shut it down or stop it. Even though on the individual file level, it was happening extremely quickly. In 2017, they came up with ransomware and worms combined, and what they called these were crypto worms and ransom worms. And this allowed them to discreetly duplicate across entire systems or network devices. WannaCry is probably the most notable of all of those. And this is where one person gets it, and then once it's in the environment, the software being using the worm technology is able to move from device to device. Once it moves to another device, it just launches and starts encrypting, moves to the next one. So this is where you'll hear a lot about segmentation and user privileges and least privilege access and why it's so important, because if you were hit with one of these, if the network won't allow it to spread or the user who's been compromised doesn't have much as far as permissions, you build in these other ways of potentially slowing it or stopping it or containing it. But WannaCry, again, being as good as it was, hit hundreds of thousands of machines in more than 150 countries. And from what I've seen, it's still working today. Obviously, there's patching and things that can be done, but when you start to get to maybe countries or areas of countries where knowledge is widespread. Maybe they don't do a good job with best practices in hygiene. Maybe they don't spend a lot of money, securing their devices. This ransomware and others can still attack and actually be successful. And then 2017 to 18, I kind of covered 2017 already, but towards that trailing end and into 2018, all the way through the present, they've gone again and made a shift into the introduction of double extortion. And this is where you go from just encryption and asking for a ransom to encryption and exfiltration. You see this a lot in the recent news where they're targeting city, state, and federal government organizations, small towns, the oil pipelines, hospitals, potentially energy companies, et cetera. And really the big shift here and why this one is so critical is we've discussed this in a previous live stream where a lot of folks did not consider ransomware attacks as breaches because if your files were encrypted, but they were never exfiltrated, they were never shared, they were never seen by the attacker, then does that classify as a breach? And people will argue both ways. But with the addition of the exfiltration, now your files could be deleted, they could be shared, they're definitely exfiltrated so someone else has access and they have the keys to decrypt them. Now that's a breach. And now these become far more critical and important to stop or prevent because now your data or your customer's data, patient data, whatever it is, literally is leaving your environment in addition to everything's been encrypted and you can't work. So some of the containment strategies, these are high level things, but I think they're important because they're things everyone really can do if you have the right services and technologies in place. You can take a system image and capture the memory of those infected hosts or a sample. If it's something you can't do, you can always pay a third party to do it. Obviously, time is of the essence if you're paying someone. You can collect available and relevant logs. Hopefully, you're already doing that. You can contact law enforcement agencies for possible known decryption algorithms. There are some that are widely available, and maybe you can just decrypt if an attacker was using a very old variant. Some folks will say whether they want to contact law enforcement agencies or not, that's really a business decision because also, at that point, you're asking for potentially a decryption algorithm, but you're also letting law enforcement know that you've had a breach, and some organizations just don't want to do that. So I won't recommend that's on the org. You can research the ransomware variant present in your environment and look for specific guidance. So if you were able to contain it, say to 3 hosts, you could keep those 3 hosts off the network and buys you a little time to potentially research the variant. You definitely want to identify all systems and accounts that were involved in the breach. You want to remove access to those affected systems. You want to review logs from any endpoint detection and response and any intrusion detection or intrusion prevention system. This is often via a SIM or a event management product where all of the logs are being ingested into a single pane of glass. You want to look for outside in and inside out persistent mechanisms. So are we seeing things happening where there are processes or communications or traffic that's being launched from the outside in versus inside out? And one of the reasons we bring this one up is you may think that you've cleaned a individual host. You don't realize that it's affecting multiple hosts. And then if you pay attention to this inside out or outside in traffic, you can see, hey, something looks suspicious. Maybe this is spread to 2 or 3 or whatever number of machines, and you can quarantine those as well. The last 2 kind of go right on that line of containment / moving into eradication, and that is you can prioritize critical systems to be rebuilt. Obviously, every organization has systems that are more of a priority than others. Hopefully, you've determined that in advance. If not, you would need to do that quickly. And then once complete, issue password resets across all accounts. The password reset, one of the things that's being recommended is that you wait until you are fairly confident or extremely confident that the ransomware software and mechanisms and everything are eradicated from your environment, because it's somewhat obvious. If you had a user who was compromised or you had some sort of backdoor set up in your environment, you could reset passwords and the attacker still has a way to move around your network or communicate. So you would be literally changing passwords over and over, and it really wouldn't help because the attacker's still there. So a lot you can do here. There are a few of these when it comes to log files, the removing of access, the EDR and IDS SIM stuff, where that really ties to a we would call kind of an intrusion detection and response technology or program. SIM tools, these are things obviously you have to buy or have a third party like Intiva or someone else provide for you. But this is the tool and technology that are capturing all of these logs, and then the people who are manning those desks 24/7 to look at logs, look at alerts, correlate different events and logs that are taking place, determine if different alerts maybe that are low severity are tied together and they're actually a larger problem. So a lot going on there. Some of these things for some organizations will be done internally, some will be third party, and some will opt out. What I will say about this is, and this goes across ransomware and virtually every breach that you have, if these SIM, IDS, EDR, intrusion detection type systems are not in place prior to the breach that you have or the attack that you have, still setting them up after the fact is great for future security posture for your organization, but it will do nothing to the current event that you go into. And just being on the managed provider side, I often am presented with this where someone did not opt for this service. They are attacked. They're very vulnerable. This is a horrible time, to have to interact with the client, and the client just is really going, what can you do? And the answer a lot of times is nothing. The systems weren't in place, the logs weren't captured. So I really try to harp on this one, to give this one some thought, because while you're being attacked, while you're unable to work, while your company is at risk, and all the data is at risk, that's really not the time you want to hear from someone like me, sorry, I can't help you. I have to deliver that message either way, but it's not a fun one to deliver. Moving to the eradication side, we're going to assume at this point, whether it was a small or large attack, you were able to contain it and prevent it from continuing. Now you have to start reconnecting systems and restoring data from backups. We've talked about this one before in great detail about how important backups are, as well as testing the restoration process, because in this case, this isn't a test, it's real world. I put document lessons learned on here because this is a common project practice that spills over to a lot of our day-to-day operational practices. Different organizations may do it differently, but there's often some form of lessons learned meeting held, documentation, even if it's just the cleanup of a breach. Whether you do it yourself or a third party helps you, you'll get this kind of after action report, which a lot of folks will call like a lessons learned. What's common here is how often the practice actually happens and occurs within an organization. What's rarely performed is the learning from your mistakes. And I don't mean learning from a knowledge perspective. We all learn and gain knowledge just by going through any of these types of security events. But it's what do you do to prevent it from happening again? Do you need to improve your incident response process? Do you have a plan? Are the right folks on that plan? Do they have the right roles and responsibilities to make decisions? If you were in a case, and I'll speak from my experience, if I'm providing this service for you and something occurs and I reach out and I can't escalate because the names in your escalation path are no longer with the organization, the folks that don't have the right authority to make decisions, they don't answer the phone, whatever the case is, you need to fix that, right? If the attack occurs again in a month, you'll be in the same boat. You have to look at system hardening procedures, or you should look at these procedures or improving them if you have them in place. Technology changes all the time. Software you buy from vendors changes, new features and functionality exist. What more should you be doing, year to year? Improving patch cycles. This is a great one because a lot of folks may say, I'm going to patch on a quarterly basis. They have a breach and they find out, well, now it needs to be monthly at a minimum. Maybe it's weekly. It would be nice if you don't wait for that to happen, but worst case, if you do, if an end result is you improve your patching cycles and processes, fantastic. Implement, if you haven't already, and or increase vulnerability scanning frequency. It's hard to patch or know that your patches were successful or unsuccessful if you're not scanning to see what what vulnerabilities you have. It's hard to tell if someone has gone in and, in an effort to improve something in one area, inadvertently opened something else up and created a vulnerability or weakness in another area. Again, the scanning is going to tell you that. Implementing and improving security awareness training, especially in the areas of phishing, since phishing accounts for 90% or more of the attacks, is important. And then the last one's, again, consider sharing this with federal agencies to educate the community. That's a business decision. But probably most importantly, if you haven't done this already, look at what legal obligations you have for notifying your clients, patients, vendors, federal agencies. Depending on the industry vertical you work in or you reside in, you may have an obligation, let's say within 1 hour of confirming that you have a breach, it has to be reported, and there are certain agencies that you have to report to. You really should know that in advance. That if there was anything else, I'd say take that away as something that you need to look and see if you have an obligation to, because you could be held legally responsible. And then best practices, last part of the ransomware here. As I said already, conduct regularly occurring vulnerability scanning. Try not to say, well, should I be doing it quarterly? Should I be doing it semi-annually? How much does your environment change? How often do you patch? Go off of the business needs. Some businesses may not change much and may not need to do it as frequently. Others could be developing software weekly, and that really needs to be happening weekly. So it just depends. Patch as quickly and routinely as you can. Provide as much user awareness training, specifically targeting phishing and phishing variants. So there's a lot of, well, they'll change it, vishing, smishing. They just keep coming out with all these different variants, but it's how they attack, who they target, what devices they use. Maintain up-to-date antivirus. If at all possible, try to employ more advanced endpoint solutions like what we call EDR and the other tool that go well beyond antivirus signatures. Regularly test the backups and recovery of your data. Restrict permissions and apply least privilege, like I've already discussed. Segment your networks physically and or virtually whenever possible. And then kind of the last two are pretty important as well, but are a little bit more time consuming, which is have a playbook for how you manage it. And this really goes along with a documented incident response plan. It's very difficult to do anything well when you're designing it during the attack. So whatever you come up with is a good start over having nothing, right? There's this kind of model of good, better, best. Good is better than nothing. And then you can always work from there to get the better and best. And then one of the most challenging, just because of how time consuming it is disabling ports and protocols that are not in use. But if you're a small organization, or especially if you're a small organization, you have a small number of users and apps and things like that, this is actually not a difficult process. When you're a massive enterprise with lots of different applications, this becomes more time consuming and cumbersome. But if you're small and you can disable most things that aren't being used, you've really reduced your attack vector and your footprint for the attack. And then as promised, this last couple minutes here, November 2021 FBI email hack, really just kind of overview of what happened and what your takeaway is here. So an individual exploited the FBI's law enforcement enterprise portal, or LEAP. They were able to send out over 100,000 fake emails using an actual FBI email server, so it was coming from a legitimate FBI source. Their motives appeared to be to defame a single information security executive, not to cause harm to the public. So they had the ability, obviously, being able to send out emails from the FBI server to make them very complex and very realistic and try to steal data, information, whatever, but that was not what they were trying to do. It was more of shaming someone. So it almost came up and it was played off as if it wasn't as important as it really was. Multiple individuals have made some form of claim for the attack or into the attack. The FBI has failed to release additional information on what it knows. No malware or malicious attachments were found, so even if you happen to receive this, to date, there's been nothing that you have to worry about. And from the FBI, I wanted to quote two things that they had published because there's not a lot out there from them. They claim they are aware of a software misconfiguration that temporarily allowed an actor to send fake emails. And once they learned of the incident, they quickly remedied the vulnerability, warned their partners, and confirmed the integrity of their networks. The claim specifically was they took the server down that was vulnerable. I know all of us, depending on just how much you stay in kind of contact with the news and seeing these stories, there's clearly a different set of expectations on us when we have an incident like this versus the federal government. We would be expected to provide a lot more information. So please use my previous slides as things that need to occur because of the legal liability. Whereas in the FBI's case, no disrespect to the government, but they're a government agency. And if they don't tell us things, if they don't, share information with us, there's really nothing we can do about it. But that case is obviously not the same when we flip backwards, and it's us who's had a breach. And on that note, I will stop it there and then look at the chat here. Okay, so looking at the chat, there was a comment about echoing, but that seemed to be kind of isolated. So from a Q&A perspective, I know we have about 3 minutes left. I don't see any questions in the Q&A section, but if anybody wants to ask one, I'm happy to spend the 3 minutes here to answer them. Okay, if not, we will call that a wrap. And as I said, you can look to our website and invitations for the upcoming live streams for 2022 as soon as we get those populated. And on that note, thank you very much for your time, and see you all next time.